Welcome to the Cortex webinar series. My name is Gordon Parker. This particular webinar is about organization design. It's something that we regularly get involved with as an organization. It's something that we felt that people in the real estate and facilities industry would find useful to know more about. First of all, we thought it would be useful to separate out some of the key elements associated with the way the design comes together. So we've talked a little bit about here, we'll talk a little bit about the theory associated with organization design, and we'll be using a particular case study to give an example of a how-to. We'll be talking about the processes that we use, and we'll be talking about some of the tests that we do to help organizations to see what their choices are and what choices they should make. And this is the main sectioning inside of the agenda. So we'll talk about the general shape of the organization and the way that the choices come together. We'll be talking about the information we gather, how we create the models, how we test them, and at the end we'll be talking about the top 10 issues that relate to this particular subject. Well, first of all, what is an organization? Well, it's the structural way that the organization assembles and manages itself in order to do what it sets itself out to do. Now, in the context of this particular presentation, the organization, you could perhaps be forgiven for thinking that the organization is the host for the facilities and real estate part of the organization itself. So I apologize if as we go through we perhaps use the word organization meaning facilities and real estate specifically, whereas you might also use exactly the same description and terminology for the process for the wider organization, because obviously designing an organization, whether it's the whole or whether it's the part, uses a lot of the same processes and a lot of the same approaches. It's about assembling resources to achieve something with reasonable clarity, with reasonable understanding of what it is that you're going to get out of it, because there's a purpose for organizing in a particular way. It's not a random assembly of people or processes. And in particular here we'll be using a methodology which is about bringing together subsystems or bundles of tasks and purposes in order to achieve an overall output for the department. We will of course be looking at assigning responsibilities and accountabilities for the outputs, and we will be using an overall approach which ties together these four areas which are picked up from, as you can see, the re-engineering the corporation from Michael Hammer. The main thing that people think about when they're looking at organizations is who works for who. And in fact, it's not really about that at all. It's about what the organization is trying to do, how it's organizing itself to produce its outputs, rather than who is the manager, who is the subordinate, which very often people see as an end result, but that's not what the design is all about. The design is about trying to align the processes, the values and beliefs, the management and measurement systems, and indeed the way that the organization rewards itself. So if as we go through here there are some areas that we focus on more than others, for example the structure, that's because of the fact that we felt that was most relevant to be able to get across some value in the discussion today. If you were going to look at creating an organization, it would be important to look at the content of every job. It would be important to look at the job structure, the grading, the rewarding, and the performance management as well. And certainly if we were looking at that as if it was, perhaps if we were going to do the presentation for a couple of hours, we would cover those in more detail. But today we're going to focus on the essentials of the structure. One of the things that comes across very clearly when you're looking at an organization is that sometimes the way that it all fits together just kind of feels right, it fits right. And this tuning fork is really about this feel for the way that the organization looks and feels, and very often it empathizes, it fits together inside of what the organization is intending to do, the way the organization is structured. And you'll see some of the ways that we've considered that as part of the overall process today. So it's about aligning, tuning, fitting together the entity that relates to the facilities and real estate part of the organization inside of the organization as a whole, but still allows real estate and facilities to organize itself effectively. One of the challenges that organizations have is that they design themselves in one particular shape, and the fact of it is that the way that it works now and the way the organization is progressing and what it's doing now might not be the same at some time in the future, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in the future. So it's not uncommon to see an organization designing part of itself or the whole of itself and then deciding to do something different in the future. So there's not necessarily in this design process a solution which will be forever. And very often it's worthwhile considering that if you've got an organization which hasn't changed for 5 years or more, is that still working as efficiently and effectively as it could do? Or do you perhaps have competitors who are doing it in a different way? And are there opportunities to work more efficiently and effectively? So this process is about trying to find that level of efficiency and effectiveness. The reason for the design sometimes is pretty clear. There's a person that comes in from outside, there's a new person, and they say, I want things to be different, and they want to put their stamp on the organization. Sometimes that's a chief executive, sometimes it's a chief financial officer or a director of estates, or indeed sometimes it might be a new country manager or a new head of a section of the organization that pushes for things to be different. So that's one of the key things that makes things happen, but very often that isn't the case at all. There are other things, like the organization decides to go into a production environment, or it decides to expand to another geography. It might have started off as a country-focused organization, and it starts to expand and starts to occupy a number of geographies. It might well be that the organization expands its retail arm, or it might be that it squeezes because the organization is getting smaller. But the change of the organization drives the changes inside the support functions, including HR, IT, and indeed real estate and facilities. So a change in what the organization does could be one of those drivers. Also, it might be that the marketplace is changing. It might be that your competitors are doing different things, and in which case you need to respond. In some cases, in fact, you may decide, or the person inside the estates and real estate and facilities function might decide that they want to emulate, copy what somebody they've met in the industry does. It might be that they want to learn lessons from other organizations. And indeed, that's perfectly fair, provided what you're trying to do makes good sense for your organization. A key driver for change is the fact that you may have a country-focused or a cultural-focused organization that is trying to, or has in the past, organized itself all from its host country. So, for example, Anglo-Saxon, the American and the British businesses in particular have always liked to organize themselves focused on the host country. So the British and the Americans over the past 20 or 30 years have had head office functions, and then they've always seen the other areas as regions and as perhaps not the place where the most senior people would sit. However, many organizations, and including the British and the Americans, have gone more to a federal model, a more decentralized model, a more regional model over the course of the last 10 years. And certainly here there is an opportunity to say, should we in fact diversify, dissolve, move away from a centralized model and look at how we organize ourselves on a country-by-country basis, or perhaps a time zone basis, or a region basis, or even a language basis. So if you're moving from an old model to a new one, again, you've got design opportunities there. You may also have a procurement-driven initiative where the opportunity might be there to make the organization more lean, perhaps to drop out some tasks out into the marketplace and let the suppliers deal with it. And again, you'd be saying, do we keep the same overall organization, or do we do it in a different way? So there are a number of things which might drive the requirement for the design. Now we do have quite a few elements in here which are about how to approach the design, and some of it comes from good practice, some of it comes from the experience that we've learned which we've converted into good practice for our own organisation, and there are quite a lot of individual items here. So if you want to see each of these individual items, please feel free to let us know you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, and we'd be happy to share this with you. But you can see that in this page and the next page there are a number of individual items which you don't necessarily have to remember. You can use the PowerPoint slide for reference in the future. So the first one is the key one, which is the organization future. What is it the organization is looking to do, and what does it demand of the real estate and facilities organization going forward? It needs to be optimum. It needs to be only what it needs to be. It doesn't need to be any particular shape or structure that is inefficient. It needs to be focused on the deliverables for the organization. And it should also be strategic. And strategic in this sense is, first of all, that you need to be clear what your choices are, and you need to be clear that it's focused on the objectives of the organization. So when we get to the end and we look at the choices that we have, we'll be saying, are we focused on what the organization is trying to do, and what range of choices do we have in order to make sure that we get the result that we want? We'll be using a methodology which is about bringing together subsystems. So for example, the real estate and property type of activities, and the supplier activities, and communication activities, and the customer focus activities. You can say, well, should they be all in the same place, or should they be in separate packages? Should we have a manager responsible for one area? Should we have a manager responsible for a function? And we'll be looking at some of the tests for that. You'll also be looking, obviously, at the functions. You'll be looking at the professional areas. You'll be looking at service areas. You'll be looking at communications and customers. And, of course, we'll be looking at whether we should be focused on locations and structuring our organization around locations. In fact, it might well be that the locations are production locations, or they might be warehouse locations, or you might be offices. And in some cases you can say, we'll deal with everything of a particular type in a particular way. And in some cases you may say, we'll have specific focus on the location, and we will make sure that everything is location biased. So everything is centralized on the service being delivered at that place. Clearly we'll be picking up on authority. That's one of those things that comes as a byproduct of organization, the element of authority, very often financially, very often decisions. But one of the things that has happened in the last 30 or 40 years is that there's a lot more decentralization of devolving responsibilities. So in actual fact, we would like to think that the responsibility for delivering things is as low down the organization as possible. So certainly if you're working in an organization where the decisions have to be pulled up all the time, then that sounds like that's a structural problem and a behavior problem that needs to be dealt with. So maybe thinking about the organization in a different way would help to think about how you can trust people lower down or in less senior parts of the organization to make decisions. And an organization review would help with that. You should watch out for the temptation of saying who works for who, and that's very often one of those things that comes out at the beginning of the process, that there's always been a manager and a subordinate or supervisors and teams, and at the beginning we should try wherever possible to be aware of how those hierarchies work as part of the review, but it's not by any means a guiding light for the way the design should work. There's also the span of control. How many people does a person have reporting to them? Don't get too obsessed with that. There are some good guidelines for, you don't want 150 people reporting to you, and it doesn't make any sense to have one person managing one person. But we shouldn't be getting too obsessed about trying to make it an exact number. For example, creating a structure which is just simply there to fill in the number of people reporting. That would be not helpful. But we do need overall to say we don't want the organization to be too flat, and we don't also want the organization to be too peaked. And we also shouldn't be too obsessed with who is doing the current jobs at the moment and trying to create positions for people. And I'm sure if you've ever been involved in an organization that reshapes itself, very often it does seem to be about trying to maintain jobs for the people in senior positions. Certainly we're not approaching it like that, but it's one of the tests at the end that says, how would it look if we consider this organization populated by the people we have? But that is right at the very end and is absolutely not a driver for the design. I did also mention that we need to make sure that the organization serves the purpose of the main host organization with real simplicity and without complexity. So this is another slide with particular details on. I'll go through this relatively quickly. You need to make sure if you do find issues associated with current performance that those problems are tested, that you don't take what people say or the sort of challenges that people have as being real reasons for shaping the design. Very often these are just simply a symptom of individual managers and symptoms of the way the organization has worked in the past. They're not a guide for you to shape the organization in the future. You should also identify that when you are doing your solution, you eliminate any of those things that used to be problems. But again, it's not a guiding light for the organization design itself. We need to be looking for where we have teams of people working together, whether they're in, for example, a more reactive mode where you need people to support them, to support other people like themselves in responding to problems. We need, for example, people who have a professional responsibility, for example, surveyors or engineers. You might well want to put them in centres of expertise, but you might also say it makes more sense to diversify and spread them across in a more a matrix management, meaning that you've got the activity that they do and the, for example, engineering and the projects that they work on, working in a management structure that looks like this. So instead of having everybody reporting vertically, you actually have the ability to assign people onto individual projects. So they might be part of a group of engineers or part of a group of surveyors, but they might actually be working on customer-focused activities with a manager in this area as well as the line management structure you would traditionally see. You need to make sure that you understand where work comes from. So we will be talking about the demand drivers as we go through this process, and we'll be talking about what causes work, how much work is there in the design, how much to be dealt with by the design. Rather than trying to pick people and fill jobs, think about how much work you actually have to do and who does it. And we'll also be talking about identifying how to drop off work that you shouldn't be doing. You deprioritize and stop work later in the process. Focusing on the customer and making sure that the customer believes that you're doing a good job for them. And that includes not just people who are the customers of the organization itself, but also the people who are customers inside. So if, for example, you're working in a technology business or a manufacturing business or any type of organization where you're producing something for a customer, whether it's retail or business to business, you may well be seeing the customer of the organization as your customer in some cases, because they come into your premises. You may be selling them products directly inside of your premises, but you also have everybody who works for the company. Everybody who works for your organization is a type of customer as well. You might in some cases have heard terminology like a beneficial user, or a person who is a stakeholder who gets the services that you provide for them but may not actually pay for them. You do need to make sure that you're thinking about those customers and you think about how you're going to engage with them. I mentioned a few moments ago about where you need to pull together people in fast response teams, and you also need to pull people together where they may need to collaborate for projects, planning, organizing. So again, these are opportunities to pull together resources, pull together skills in areas where you need people to work together on a particular task or a process. The challenge that many organizations have is that they don't necessarily think about what's going to happen when people leave. They don't think about what happens if people get promoted. And one of the challenges is that without succession planning, you end up with holes, which you sometimes have to fill by going outside and bringing people in again. Making sure that you're thinking about succession planning is a key secondary aspect of the design. It's not a primary aspect because you're not going to drive the design by looking at who works for who, but you are going to say, once we've got this overall organization, how are we going to make sure that we can staff it in the future, and where will the people come from? And we need to identify anywhere that we've got pockets of expertise or pockets of knowledge, where in the event that they were to disappear, that it would jeopardize the organization. The grading, rewarding, and the management of staff may be something that at a top organizational level, is dictated and pushed through people like HR within the organization. But you do need to make sure that you do have appropriate grading and rewards, because it's challenging managing people without them feeling that they are appropriately rewarded, that they've got in some cases, a level of recognition and a level of status in the organization. But again, you're not trying to design the organization to create opportunities for people, but it's a test at the end to make sure that you should align the grading and responsibility and motivation of staff to make sure that you are getting the performance that you want from the organization. The methodology that we use is not particularly very far away from good practice. We pull together information, and we'll talk to you in a moment about where that information comes from. We analyze the information, and sometimes we use, as you can see at the bottom there, a reference from outside. We look at what other organizations are also doing. So if they're in a particular marketplace, if you're in a, for example, a public sector marketplace, or if you're a retailer, or if you're an organization which is focused primarily on production, you would have a different way of thinking about your real estate and facilities to other organizations. But there are other organizations like you, so it's worthwhile learning from those other organizations, and perhaps not trying to emulate or copy, but certainly take ideas where possible, steal good practices, try and identify what other people have done and how it works, and look if there are lessons that you can learn from that. The reviewing part we'll talk about in a moment, and we believe that it's important to make sure that the people inside of the organization that you maybe are going to change understand the implications and understand where the process is going. This, of course, is one of the areas that causes a lot of fear and doubt. People, organization design, people are saying to themselves, what's going to happen to me? So it's an interesting way of thinking about it, that if you were them, what would you want to know? What is it you need to tell them in order to make sure that you don't have a rebellion inside of a team that you might be working with? So collaborating with the team in order to look at the future and their future is an important part of the overall process, not doing it completely aside and independent and perhaps causing fear and doubt. And then at the end, obviously, we'll finalize the way the solutions come together. And very often those solutions have to be sold inside the organization to people in senior positions like CFO, CEO, and maybe sometimes even the board. So collecting information. I'll quickly identify each of these things because they are, each of them has a purpose. You need to have a plan. You need to know what you're going to gather. You need to have a place to put the information, and you need to make sure that you've got collaboration inside of the organization to get this information. So some of the information, for example, contracts, the job descriptions, the purposes and policies that the organization has, you can collect all of that together with collaboration inside of the company. And you can pull that together, and we prefer as an organization to keep that all online in secure storage using a piece of software. That means that the organization that we work with, the organizations we work with, can see what's being shared. They can be clear if there's an updated version that something gets replaced, you can see that. And you can also be sure when you haven't got something. So you need an information required schedule which you actively manage, and you need to make sure that you are picking up the key information you need in order to be able to consider the design. In addition to the hard copy information, you also can talk one-to-one with people inside the organization. You can have group interviews, and you can also, if we're looking at the demand side, you could be talking to the senior people inside the organization, perhaps the customers of the organization, and perhaps other organizations that have an interest in the same marketplace. So there's a number of places where you could potentially source your information. Also, for people who have an expertise in organization design, there's nothing like actually going and seeing for yourself how people work, how property is managed, how the supply network works, how customer service is dealt with, and using your experience and applying your understanding so that you can provide information that you simply couldn't get by the people inside. So that's always a good reason, of course, to have a person from outside, whether it's a consultant or whether it's somebody from another part of the organization to collaborate with, to have an extra pair of eyes to look for information. What we do once we've got this information is we generally tend to use an analytical process of cataloging in using tools like Excel, and presenting information in a way that that people can understand using the detail. So although the detail may involve pulling information from contracts and pulling information from various documents, it's all catalogued and classified in order to be able to do, as you can see, the first review here, which is this relevant to the organization review or is it not? If it isn't, strip it out and only pull in the things you need to consider. Here's an example of the sort of classification that you may use. It might be that the information is related to customers and stakeholders, data and systems, etc. So you can then bundle together the information in order to be able to think about it and consider it. Some information may be in more than one classification, in which case bundle it and label it twice. So if you need to think about processes and outputs because it relates to the customers, then you need to think about it in two places. So if you're collecting information related to the way that projects are managed, if you're collecting information into the way that finance is organized and money is approved, you may need to classify and think about things in more than one way. Now, I mentioned that there is the demand side information a little earlier. By this I mean that where you are looking at what the organization does itself, the way that it works now, if you think about that perhaps as the supply side, which is the thing that the organization produces. But on the demand side, that's the thing which is pulling the result out of the organization. So obviously what the corporate objective or the organization objective actually has for itself is one of those things that pulls out objectives, pulls out services. And very often organizations have a vision for themselves, they have objectives for themselves. But I would also say that if you've had the opportunity to look for yourself at corporate objectives, they don't tend to focus on real estate and facilities because that's not what their business is about. So one of the things to be aware of is that you might need to do some interpretation, you might need to push your agenda up to the chief executive, CFO, etc., the heads of business, so that they can understand how your contribution can provide some value for them, so that when they're producing their corporate objectives, that they're capturing some of the elements which relate to what you produce. So, for example, whether it's catering, whether it is cleanliness, whether it's health and safety, whether it's about producing a working environment which is stimulating and energizing, whether it's about being able to move into a new product area or a new country quickly, whether it's about being able to move from one place to another quickly. Whatever it is, try and make sure that you're aligning the deliverables inside of the real estate and facilities area with what the organization needs and get your objectives pushed up onto the corporate objectives. You may need to look at not only what your organization is doing, but what your competitors are doing. And in fact, you may need to be able to demonstrate that you can change what you have quite quickly. So, for example, things like lease terms, things like scalability inside of your organization might be key aspects. We mentioned the scalability just a few seconds ago, and certainly you may decide that rather than having a lot of direct employment, you might decide to have a thin organization and allow the scalability part to work through supply partners. That would be relatively typical, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years, where organizations certainly have used the large supply organizations, both as managing organizations or individual specialist functions, to scale up and to be able to support the organization at new locations, or perhaps saving money, or perhaps even delivering a better experience for customers by using the expertise of the supply chain. There's also the challenge of making sure that whatever you do fits together with the company process. So things like project management, things like the governance processes you use have all got to fit together with the company itself, the organization itself. And of course, you need to think about how you can expand into particular geographies and indeed where necessary to withdraw. Where your organization comes from, where the head office or the head offices are, may be one of the things that make you think about the way that you structure your organization. So you may decide to have your most senior people where the most senior people in the organization are. Now, that is by no means the only solution. You could well find that you have senior people from your organization in multiple locations, possibly in different time zones. So it might be that it's not relevant at all. But you may also find that it's absolutely vital to have the most senior people in a place where the decision makers are, possibly in the room next to them, possibly somewhere where you can get easy access to them. However, again, this is not necessarily the only consideration, but it's one of those things that you can look at and one of the things you should consider. And of course, you've got the production resources. Where are you going to hold your expertise associated with making sure that your business does the things that it does, whether it's whether you're producing hard items or whether you're on customer service? You need to think about where your people need to be. And last there, it's about the language side. You may well need to have multiple language skills inside of your organization in order to make sure that you can deal with the customer base and in order to make sure that you can work effectively across whatever geography you need to. Now, we did mention a few seconds ago about production resources, and it does depend on what the organization is all about here, the brand and the range of services that your customer provides. Sorry, I won't say customer, I mean your host organization. So if you're all about hygiene, if you're all about customer focus, if you're all about just in time, if you're all about whatever it is, then your organization has got to respond to that and has got to have elements that it addresses which responds to the culture of the organization. And I'm sure if you've been involved with senior management in organizations, you will have already picked up the things that they want will be related to the things that they need to provide themselves and what they think is important. And that might include relationships with customers. It might include projecting a particular image. We also have inside of real estate and facilities a need to make sure we manage risks. And this SLEPTE is social, legal, economic, political, technical, and environmental analysis. It's one of those things that you need to make sure that you have some expertise in order to make sure that you are testing your organization and testing the future of your design, saying if things change, if risks happen, what will be the consequence on the organization. So something like this SLEPT analysis is always very useful to do. Now, we did think it might be useful for you to see, as an example, what a brand might say. So we've shown you here what the Cortex brand is about, and it's relatively straightforward. It's about the area of business. It's about what we believe the organization does, we as an organization do, what our values are, and perhaps some element of geography or spread. And at the last element there, we've got perhaps something about the way we approach things, how we feel about ourselves. So the brand is something that will permeate, come from your host organization, and should go right the way through everything that you do. We are also going to be making sure when we're doing our design that the total amount of work that we need to do is understood. And it really depends on how you classify work. Well, let's say, for example, that we're going to talk in this case about knowledge work, thinking work. So on the left-hand side of the slides at the bottom, you've got this person doing some thinking. And in your organization, you do need to have the elements associated with strategic thinking, planning, organizing, governing. So you need to have that somewhere. And perhaps you think about it as being in pockets of organization, but you may also need to have it in layers as well. So in each of the sections of the organization, you may need to say, where is my thinking, planning, and organizing? But as I say, you may have it in a separate area as well. Secondly, you might need to have teams working together, teams that might need to have the same skills, or it might well be they need to have parallel skills. And they might be working on processes which mean to say that they hand work from one to the next. And maybe they need to be in the same area. Maybe they don't. So again, you've got choices about how you approach the design. You also need to think about some areas where you need to have some strength for, you can see our gentleman down here on the right, negotiating, defending our position, and maybe in that area we've got things like how we might organize security or risk management or environmental awareness, and how we might manage our relationship with our supply chain. Right at the beginning of creating the structure, and I'll give you an example to illuminate this, you need to think about the responsibilities that facilities, real estate, estates actually has. To give an example, we worked together with a major organization that expanded it across the world and was producing goods and became a multi-billion company, and it decided to rationalize its facilities and real estate. And one of the things it did right at the very beginning was it said, how do we differentiate ourselves, separate out what we do from HR, from IT, from finance? And the reason for that was that as the organization grew, HR, IT, and finance had decided, for whatever reason, that they had areas of scope that included taking out leases, or included contracting, or included health and safety, etc. So one of the things to do is to be clear what the scope of your department is, and to agree that in a constructive way at a senior level inside of the organization, and to separate it out from HR, IT, and finance. Why is that important? Well, if you don't, then you will find that you are talking to other parts of the organization, sometimes the core business, where they believe they have a responsibility for something, and you might believe that in fact you should. So if you're going to get devolved budgets, if you're going to have responsibility, if you're going to collaborate across the company with various functional areas, and indeed with your host organization, you need to know what your various responsibilities are. And down the side here you can see also some of the areas you might have responsibility for, or you might not. It might be that in fact retail outlets are not part of your responsibility. They might be dealt with in a different way. It might be that accommodation is not dealt with inside of your area. It might be that there's a separate part. And it might be things like catering, investment property are dealt with separately. So for all of these, if we're doing a design, we'd be thinking to ourselves, is this an opportunity to now bring this area which was previously separate into consideration? Doesn't mean it's a good idea, it just means that you should think about it and that your design should consider it. One of the more detailed aspects of the design is to look at the total volume of work and who is doing what. So here's an example from a case study, an organization that we work with, where we said, how many hours is everybody working? You can see this is only a sample here. And what do they do? And one of the advantages of trying to separate out what people do is you may find that in the current structure, you've got workload peaks where you didn't expect it. You may have certain people who are being overworked because the volume of work is growing and growing in their area, and for whatever reason they are one person or two people or five people aren't enough, and you need to provide more resources. You need to know this because if you're going to scale your organization, you need to know how much work is inside, and you also need to know whether the work needs to be done. You need to know whether people should be focusing in the professional area but are wasting their time doing administration. You need to know whether the administration is rational. So this is just a simple toolkit for gathering information saying how much work is there at the moment. And also we would normally ask, how is it likely to be in the future if some of the things that we talk about on the demand side happen? So we've gathered all this information together. We very often put these things into spreadsheets and we sort it out into classifications and importance. And then what we do is we pull apart anything which looks like it's relevant, and we try to pull it into some kind of a grouping to say, how can we think about it? And you'll remember that we've got already in the classifications the customer side, we've got the management parts, and then we start thinking about, is it about people, is it about processes, is it about volumes of work? And that then allows us to look at the complexity in nice simple parcels. That means to say that we can begin to put some rational thought into the way the structure might work. It also allows us to say, do you know, with the size of organization we've got at the moment, have we got the scalability that we need in order to be able to not only do what we do now, but how about in the future? And one of the procurement things to consider is whether in fact using supply partners or even a managing supply partner will give you some flexibility in the future. Now, again, we're not trying to say that this should be a driving feature of the design. We are in fact saying that it's one of those things that you should consider, but it's not saying that lower down here is better than higher up. And in fact, if you were to look at the overall approach for the host organization, as long as it gets everything dealt with, does the procurement strategy need to come in right at the top with your main organization design? And sometimes it doesn't. What we would say here is, though, that if you're talking about doing an overall strategic design, it would be missing out an opportunity if you don't consider procurement as one of those areas that you think about when you're trying to layer your design and work out how many people you need to have in-house. The driving feature also, as I mentioned earlier, includes geography. So you need to think about whether you need to place people in particular locations. Certainly when you go outside of the time zone, you might be thinking about whether you need to have people in other time zones. And you may decide what type of people you need to have in those time zones, whether it's customer focused, regional focused, whether it's real estate people, or whether it's facilities people. And again, you'd be looking at your supply chain saying, how do I get supported across multiple geographies? You also have the opportunity to think about the way that your host organization, I'm going to use the expression customer here, your internal customer, is organized, whether they are in fact time zone oriented, whether they're country by country packaged, or regional. And you may decide that you want to orient your design of your organization around the way that the customer is packaged. Now again, you don't necessarily have to say that is the way to do it, but it's one of the choices that you can have in your overall approach. You should also be thinking about what you're doing now and deciding whether in fact you want to keep doing it. So there's a very simple matrix here about saying if you're doing it now and it's valid, it's important, and your analysis determines you should keep it, fine. But it might well be that you are doing some things that you decide that you should stop. And that takes some bravery, because there are some challenges with people believing that the things that they have done in the past are important. The fact of it is, if you don't need to do it, do consider stopping it. Now we've got a case study here at the end of our presentation, which we'll take you through. And this is what we were asked to do by a UK university. We asked by them to look at the way they do things and how they do it. We were looking at the good practice, so we went to 12 other universities and compared what they did to them. We worked together with their senior team and we consulted with them to discuss what might happen. We finalized the design with their senior management team, and then we helped them to cascade the methodology down into the teams themselves. So as part of this last element of our presentation today, we'll be showing the very high level element of the design. But you can, I'm sure, see that when we go down into the organization, we would have engineers, we would have designers, project managers, CAD people, administrators, etc., sectioned out in appropriate bundles in accordance with what we were saying earlier. So, first of all, what we did was we went not only to the host organization, but we benchmarked them with other similar organizations. And you can see here this span of control difference between each of the organizations, who are fundamentally doing exactly the same thing. So you may say, should we have 5 bundles? Should we have 3 bundles? Should we have 6 bundles? And in fact, they're all of these organizations, if you reorganize them, you could end up with saying they've all got broadly the same things in them. So is it important to have 3, 4, 5? Which is the best solution? Well, for each of these organizations, it was the best solution for them, because it suited the way that they wanted to bundle together their expertise. It suited the way that they wanted to align themselves with their host organization, and it also meant in some cases that they had to deal with the fact that they had people that were in positions that positions of authority that the host organization thought was important. For example, accommodation management, for example, security, for example, project management, for example, health and safety. And the organization pulls up those roles and says, I want to deal with these things separately. And as part of the review that we did, we said what were the things that the organization needed to look at in this final result. So things like customer focus, making sure that the organization itself, the university, was getting competitive advantage, that it actually makes sure that the resources, the way that resources were bundled together in the final structure all made sense, and identifying, you can see things like missing skills, where they may not be in-house at the moment. Should they bring them in? Should they procure them from somewhere else? And also at the end, trying to identify whether whatever the design is actually feasible, whether in fact you can go from where you are now to the next stage without completely breaking the organization. And in most cases, that's simply a case of coming up with a rational structure in the change plan. We sat down and talked to the client. This is the sort of thing that you would normally expect to do. First of all, make sure that you've got your most senior stakeholder engage with what you're saying. You're not going to say anything too shocking, and that if you're going to, for example, recommend that you lose half the staff, or you recommend that the organization is bundled in such a way that you're going to make people very unhappy, then at least test that with your senior stakeholder first of all, just so that you've got the sensitivity management part of it dealt with. And then it's a good idea, and in every case when we are involved with design, to share the design models with a wider group. Not the whole team, because the whole team could be hundreds of people, but a group of people who can actually say, do you know what, you're thinking about this in this way and you've missed the fact that whatever. And I would say that in most of the cases where we do design, there's something that comes up at the end where there's something hidden or something that people know, or things they've tried before, or things where you've got a senior person inside of the management team who says, this won't work because, and in which case, fine, get it out on the table and talk about it. So at the end of the day, you end up with a range of options. We just happen to be showing here one, but there might be two or three, and we then go through and present all of the considerations associated with the design and say, this is how we're going to address all of these issues. Now, in this particular case, the issues are the ones shown on the side here. In the case study that we had, that was relevant. It might not be relevant in the organization that you're looking at, the organizations that you might be considering. But down here at the bottom, just be careful not to be too tempted by trying to create diagrams where you're trying to work out who works for who and give people jobs. Don't get too concerned about that. Make sure you're bundling this, you can see here, right at the top level to pick up a sensible way of pulling the information together, and then go down inside of each of these and do the same thing. Bundle the logic together at the top, bundle the logic together in each of the departments. Don't start off by drawing an entire organogram and trying to say who works for who and fit everybody in. That's not a good idea and is not good practice. And also, at the end of the day, there should be as little complexity as you can possibly manage. So, top 10 issues. First thing, focus on the future and the drivers for change. Look ahead, don't get obsessed with what you've got now. Secondly, avoid the temptation to simply say, that isn't working, we should change that. And that is a fault, I would say, of consultants coming into organizations. They do try and find problems and say, here's a problem, this is how you should fix it. And they're obsessed with the fixing of the problem rather than designing something that works for the future. Thirdly, be sensitive to the fact that your reason for being there, the reason for doing the review, might be because somebody has an agenda and you need to address that agenda. Doesn't mean you have to comply, but it means to say that you need to be aware that you will be asked questions to answer why you're doing things. Fourthly, make sure that things flow. Whether you've got processes where you need to make sure you don't have silo thinking, or whether in fact you need to have resources bundled together, but as I was mentioning before, you might lend your resources across into project groups. Make sure that if you've got any of those problems that we talked about earlier on, that you are fixing them, because people will say, how are you dealing with it? And consider this layering that I talked about with the host organizations and how your suppliers will fit in, and how in fact you're going to align and manage those suppliers. Use the sorts of considerations that we've talked about earlier on to say, what if? What happens if people leave? What happens if we expand in a particular part of the organization, etc. And use workshops to explore and engage together with the team in order to get them on board. Certainly, in order to make it work, you're going to have the organization working with you. And you can either have a strong governing hand and push, or you can have them working with you in order to make it work. You need to make sure that each of the essential elements of the change and the essential elements of the future are explained, because people will ask why. And you'll recall in the case study we had a couple of slides ago, we had broken out each of the individual considerations for the design and said, this is the reason why we're going to do that. Admittedly, we just were showing headlines there, but in each of those cases you need to say, this is why we're making this decision, and this is why this organization works. And lastly, that any presentation that you do of your final solution might not need to be only inside of the department, but it might need to be to quite senior people. So keep your explanation simple, keep your diagram simple, keep your reasoning simple, and focus on the big picture. So that's the presentation today. If you have any questions, please feel free to go onto the website and to get in touch with us. And if you're interested in any other webinars, we've got 2 other webinars coming up in 2013, and there'll be some more later on in the year. And we look forward to seeing you on one of those webinars in the future. Thank you very much for watching and listening.